Everybody, welcome to the Rock Room. Today we're going to be working on a greenstone cab. It's about 12 carats, so a little over 2 grams. And we're going to bezel set this in 935 Argenium silver. So let's get started. Okay, so first thing to do is to measure out your cabochon. And I do that simply with a piece of a sticky note, which I slice across the sticky part of the sticky note. And I pull off and I use it to measure around the greenstone. This gives me the most accurate measurement that I can lay on my piece of silver. I use a razor blade to cut or mark the exact spot. And I can't stress enough this part being probably the most important part of making your piece, is getting that measurement right. And then checking that measurement by folding it around the greenstone and then making sure you have a perfect measurement. Then I take this off of the greenstone, and I'm pretty much done with the greenstone for a while. So I'll put the cover back on it and put that away. Now it's time to work on the bezel. So this is Argenium silver. This is sheet bezel. And what I'll do is I'll put it right here on the end. Take it just like that. And so this is what it'll look like stuck to that piece of sheet. And then I never cut it exactly the same length as I measured. You notice I'm holding it right so you can see it. Now what I'll want to do is I want to mark approximately a millimeter or so bigger with my razor blade. And I'll make a mark right on the silver before I cut. And then I'll cut the silver slightly larger than what I measured. This gives me a slightly larger piece, and then I can take my file and I can sort of work this edge and make this edge nice and flat for soldering. So I want to make sure that these edges are nice and square. Both edges. And then from there, it's fairly simple. I just take, basically my bezel tool has a nice round edge on it, and I'll just roll it around that bezel tool. It gives me a nice round shape. And I usually want the bezel to be joined on the side of the oval, kind of like that. And you want the silver to naturally lay in the correct position without any tension on the band whatsoever. So you just kind of work it with your fingers until you get that perfect fit. And it takes a little bit of practice and it takes a little bit of time, but you just kind of feel that metal until it naturally lays as perfect as you can make it with no tension. Just like that. So now it's ready for some flux. So I use just handy flux. It's just a paste. It's pick it up at Rio Grande. It's fairly cheap. I I've had that bottle for several years, and it just seems to still keep giving me some flux. So I'll just like that on the inside as well, so that both sides are fluxed. And then sometimes I'll work it back and forth like that, just so I get the flux exactly where I want it. And if you see, like, the band isn't lined up perpendicularly. See if I can focus this a little better. But that's not as important, because I'm gonna flatten out the planes on both sides after this is soldered together. So get the soldering block out here. See if I can get this where you can see it. Get the torch. And my solder. I use wire solder. There's a lot of people that use different forms of solder. There's flake solder. This just seems to work the best for me in my application. So what I'll do is I'll warm the whole band up, and you'll see the solder kind of dance on the band, and it's just heating up basically and drying. So you just want this it'll turn several different colors before it starts getting ready to accept the solder. The key is not to melt your bezel before you get the solder on it, otherwise you're starting over. But you need it hot enough to melt the solder, but not too hot to melt the bezel. And see, that's a perfect job right there. Perfect. I'll pick that up. I dropped it in the water to cool it off. And silver cools almost instantly, so there's our bezel. Perfectly done. So now we'll take it over to my machine over here. This is why it didn't matter if this was perfectly lined up or not, because I'm going to put this right on the flat lap, just like that, and I'm going to flatten this bezel out as we go here. So there's that. It's a lot lower profile now. I'm just gonna take a rag and wash this off. Come back over. Okay. Now, if you can see it or not, there's an edge burring right around the edge of this. It's on both sides. And what I had done is I had taken a look at my cabochon before I started. And I had seen the profile of this cabochon. And just by looking at it, I can match up the profile that I need on this bezel. With a little experience, I kind of know how tall to make that bezel, and I left this a little long or a little tall because I'm not quite done with it, but I just like to get it close. And so we'll come back to the stone in a minute. So before I put this around the stone, I just clean this up. And if you run your file on an angle like this, you never scratch the finished surface. So even if you run the file on the finished surface side, just like this, you're not going to scratch the finished surface, but you're going to remove the burring around the. And I just rotate it with my fingers, flip it over, and then I rotate it with my fingers kind of as I do this. Now this is ready. This is ready to press onto my greenstone. So I know the shape of my greenstone is kind of long. So I'll look for an object, one of my bench tools here, and I'll just sort of try to make that shape with this bezel before I press it over the greenstone. Just like this. Usually I'll go the small end first and then sort of just try to push this over the bezel or over the greenstone. Now this one went a little bit tight, which happens. It's not a big deal. So if it's not exactly perfect, I probably should have left the bezel a little longer. But when it's not exactly perfect, I take the greenstone back over to this bench and I'll cut back around the perimeter of the stone. Here, and now this should fit a little bit better around the stone. I usually use a wooden tool if I have it laying around, wooden end of something to press these bezels down with, because the metal can be kind of sharp. Okay, now if you can see this, I've got a little bit of excess around the top edges around this stone. So what I'll do is I'll keep a constant level right here with a just a sharp point of some kind, and I'll roll the stone at the height that I want that bezel cut down to. That way when I bring it over to my flat lap, I've got a mark that I can see. It's right on my bezel where to cut to. So bring that back over here. Okay, that went very well. We're back on this side. Same thing like before, I just have to clean up this, the top edge that I ground down a little bit to bring that bezel down. Set my greenstone back on top. You want to make sure that you don't get the orientation flipped, otherwise you can keep working the wrong side, so just keep a mental note of that. And now I use a soft edge to push this bezel down around the stone. And I use a lighter, believe it or not. It's got a nice flat edge on the bottom of it. And it creates a straight wall on that bezel pretty nicely. I just use whatever's on my bench a lot of times. So now I have a nice bezel around this greenstone, and it's a little bit tall yet, and I'll get back to that. But when you solder this to the bottom plate, there's an edge that builds up on the bottom, and it pushes your stone just a little higher in that setting. So having this bezel just a little bit high, not too high, but a little high, is a good thing, because it'll shorten up once you put the back on it. That's the back now, but so this stone's going to come out. We're going to measure a piece of sheet silver for the bottom of this, and then we're going to complete the piece. Hey, we're back. Last time we were working on this greenstone cabochon, and we're going to do the rest of it. We're going to finish it. We're going to put the back on it, and then also put a bail on it. So let's get started. So we just pushed this bezel on, and we have it perfectly cut the way we want it. We're going to carefully push from the bottom. It's important that this stone comes out the top. So without losing your shape of your bezel, and this is kind of a feel thing, you just don't want that metal to move once that stone comes out. So the greenstone gets set to the side. Bezel's in the correct shape. So this is, I want to say it's 18 gauge silver, 16 or 18 gauge silver, and the purity is 935. It's typically what I use on everything. So what I'll do is I'll just flatten this out from the last time I cut it. There's like a ripple in it. So again, I'll use my lighter, and I'll roll that back out. I use a lighter for a lot more things than just lighting the torch. Okay, so now we have our sheet silver that's nice and flat. Without bending or losing our shape, I set that back on. I orientate it so that I have the least amount of waste. I take my pin tool, and this is just to scar or mark the metal. And I draw basically around the bezel with the least amount of waste possible. Set my bezel to the side, and now I'll have kind of a scar line. You can kind of see it. And I'll take, just basically it's a really good pair of scissors. Okay, I got my scissors. So these are just a nice German-made steel scissors. They're very tight, pretty high quality, and it basically you just cut the sheet silver with the scissors. I know that sounds kind of strange if it's the first time you're hearing about this, cutting metal with metal, but it works just fine. Just because this can kind of go quick, you never want to make sure your hands are clear of the blades, because if that were to cut a little quicker than you were expecting, you'd lose whatever's in there. So there's my sheet, and I'll take my lighter again. I'll just flatten that back out. Like that. Now I put the sheet back, and I make sure I know the orientation for my stamping. So I've got this is my stamp right here. This is just the metal purity stamp. This is my my Maker's Mark stamp. Okay. Now we'll take the Dremel tool, and I really like the Dremel for I like it for a lot of things, but this is just a quick, easy way. So that's the side I stamped. That's going to be the outside of the piece. You can kind of see the stamp. Now I want to flip this over, and I want to just want to sand that up. And I check my orientation to make sure I'm the correct way. And then it's time to solder the piece. So I take flux again. I run flux. Around where I know the bezel is going to make contact with the back plate. And I've kept my bezel orientated the top up. It's important you don't get that flipped over or your stone won't fit. So then I'll solder the bottom. I'll set that on top, just like that. Now it's time to solder the bezel to the back. Let's see if this looks better with the light off. And it does. So this is one of the most important things in soldering silver, is getting your temperature right. This looks like a little hot to me. And it changes with the size of your piece. So if your piece is a little bigger, it just takes a little more heat. Piece is smaller, it takes a little less heat. You'll get the hang of that. So then I'll just heat the piece up in its entirety until it stops bubbling and all of the flux paste has dissipated. And this is a charcoal block that I'm soldering on, so it's reflecting the heat back up into the piece. One thing to note on those is that your piece can get too hot very quickly. So you pay attention to the color of the metal. Make sure it doesn't get past a dull pink, or it's too hot and you're going to melt your piece. I don't think I have enough heat. That should be better. You should see your solder flowing all the way around the whole piece until you see you'll see the solder move all the way around the entire bezel, and that's how you know that you've got it completely soldered. And I'll pick this up and show you. It's gonna be a little hot right now. But you can see there's a solder bead all the way around and on the inside all the way around. And so this one turned out really perfect. So I'm just going to cool this off. And now set my block over here for the time being. It's time to get the scissors out again. So what I'll do is I'll just cut the excess silver off around the piece. And the closer you can get this to your bezel, the better. You just don't have to spend as much time grinding it on the grinder and chewing up your belts. So with a good pair of scissors you can get pretty close to that edge. So now we've got a pretty close edge. And now this is a trick that I learned along the way. Sometimes your shape isn't going to be exactly perfect around the outside edge, and what you want is a concave surface to sand around the outside edge. So what I'll do is I'll just gently push this to make sure we got a concave edge all the way around. Just like that. And it can always move back, and you're not moving it very much. You're just making sure you have a concave edge. So now we're going to go sand it. And bring this edge flush. Okay. That went very well. Dry this off a little bit. Now, it went pretty well. I've got a couple of edges that they just couldn't reach it with a flat lap. So, no big deal. You take your Dremel, and you can easily clean up some of these edges once you have somewhere to start. And all you want to do is just make sure that it will go flat and will polish. Okay, it's perfect. Here's your bezel. Now I'll just make sure it's nice and dry. I'm going to set this back down here. And I'm going to take a piece of patterned silver that I have right here. This is for the bail. So from the last time I used this, I had an edge right here that was not exactly flat, so I just reached around, flattened it real quick, and now I'll take just my round nose pliers and you can kind of determine the size of your bail by how far up or down you put here. Usually, I have a couple of marks on this, so I know pretty much where I like to have it. So, see how that made a nice kind of hoop? It's not completely closed. If you look at it, it's still open. So I need to just use my flat pliers. And push that down flat. And then it's not quite straight. So you want to make sure it's straight before you cut it, because you have leverage by hanging on to. So now what I'll do is I'll just cut this back just enough to attach it near the bottom of the bail, just like that. So now this edge has kind of just an obtuse cut from the wire cutter edge. What I'll do is I'll just sand this out a minute. It's important because this piece shows on the back of the bail. So you just want to make sure that it's just pleasing. It's in a pleasing shape. Okay. So now, I'm going to take my handy flux, and I'm going to flux the bail that I just made. You want to make sure you get flux behind both sides of this, kind of all over the bail, because the solder will flow wherever the flux is. So then I set my pendant and orientate the bail the way I want it to look. I usually point it towards me so that I can see if it's straight. And Now this is ready to be soldered. And this takes just slightly more heat, more flame than what I had before. And the reason is because you want this to kind of spot weld, kind of. When you start heating it up, the bail might dance around out of place. You just want to make sure that it's still lined up straight with the pendant. Did a good job there, but the bail moved on me a little bit, so I'm going to have to heat this back up and move the bail over slightly. Like that. Before I turn my torch off, I usually flip this over and make sure I have a nice even flow of solder around the back, which I do. And there's the pendant, ready to set the stone. There's the pendant. It's got a really nice even distribution of solder. The lines are very clean, and when I set the stone should set in there actually quite well. Just like that. So I'm not quite ready to set the stone. The metal's still too hot, and greenstones really don't do well with excessive heat. So I'm gonna cool it. I'm gonna let this cool off, and then we're gonna set the stone. Everybody, welcome back. Just finishing up this greenstone here. We've got this nice pendant we've been working on. We're gonna put the greenstone in the pendant and then set it properly. So, just going to get started. So, I've got my greenstone here, and I haven't checked this yet to see if it fit, but I don't typically have problems with them fitting anymore, so hoping for the best here. So I like putting in the small end first. So I just like putting on a pair of shoes, you put the toe in first, and then just because there's more material kind of around the back side of the stone, so that when you're putting pressure on the stone, you don't, if you did it the other way, you could chip that small tip off the top there. So usually I like to push in just like a pair of shoes. If there's a smaller end, the smaller end first. And this end is sticking up. So I'm just going to, with my thumb and my forefinger underneath, I'm just going to put some pressure, and then keep the top in with my thumb here. So I'm just going to push it in, literally down. And see, that just kind of popped down in there. And we've got a perfect bezel set greenstone. Now I'm just going to have to work the edges and then buff it up, and it's done. So when I do the edges, what I like to do is, on my particular table, I've got kind of an edge here that I can push against. So I use my bezel tool, and I'll just push against kind of back towards me because that's easier. And I'll just sort of work that bezel around. And sometimes it'll get a little wrinkly, and so you want to watch that. You want to kind of push things in evenly so that you don't get a wrinkle in your bezel. So this one's going quite well because the measurement was so perfect. I tell you, if you're working on one of these and the measurement isn't so perfect, you'll know. You'll have a lot of wrinkles like around the edge right here. And see, this one's going pretty well. So far, so good. Okay, I think I'm done with the tool. Now I'm going to take my Dremel, and I'm going to be very careful with the Dremel, because this abrasive on most of these Dremel will scratch the surface of this stone. So on this particular one, you want to be very careful not to touch the greenstone with your brush, because you could cause the surface of your greenstone to dullen. And you really want to be careful with any stone you're bezel setting. And just be mindful of the abrasive you're using. So what I'm doing here is I'm watching the greenstone, and I'm watching the brush hit the greenstone from this angle. And I'm just being careful not to roll the brush up onto the greenstone as I do this. Okay, this one's ready for the buffing wheel. It really did turn out really good. So let's go to the buffing wheel. Okay, we're done with this now. You can see we've got a really nice piece of silver. It's all buffed, cleaned, polished. and an absolutely gorgeous greenstone. So thank you for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it, and tune in next time. We're going to be working on a lot more. Thank you.